Here we are. Hello. We're Belinda, Guillem and Stephen again for another low code, 2nd of February. Hello, everyone. I've got the kids at it's creative time in the house, 7 till 8 a.m. So I'm with you guys. This is my form of creativity. And we've got the kids are doing colouring and drawing. And then Isaac next has decided he wants to create a generative source of low emissions energy. So that could be 8 till 9. We'll work on that after breakfast.
Okay.
So what have you guys got for us today?
That's awesome. Okay, Stephen's in his car, so I can see he's just dropped out, but I'm just going to launch ahead. All right. So Stephen and I have been thinking about how we could bring some focus. Is that Stephen making that noise? David, do you have control of participants?
He's just muted himself.
Okay, good. Right, there he is.
Sorry about that. I was eating some chocolate. I do apologise.
Well, that's all right then. Right. We've been thinking about how we could bring some focus to the whole low code project, right? So how do we prioritize something that we could make to test, essentially as a test of a low code environment for people? So we started thinking about what kinds of functionality could be common to the greatest possible number of different projects. So if you had 10 or 20 different projects, could we think of something that almost all of them, if not all of them, would actually need? And here's what we've come up with. So Stephen has talked before about an agreement maker. So I have renamed it a crowd maker. And in the context of Holo and Holochain, I think you could also call it a membrane manager because or a membrane maker, because what it is a piece of software functionality so it's a component of an app really that allows you to describe what your membrane is, therefore what the shared common purpose, shared intention and shared outcome is of a group that you might want to form either for a specific short-term purpose or a specific longer-term set of objectives. Could be any kind of scale, any kind of duration, but there's something core there around defining shared purpose, shared vision, shared principles, shared agreements about, therefore, how we behave that helps to, in Holochain terms, deal with membranes, navigate membranes, but also is important for a whole lot of different kinds of apps of all different sizes and scales. And so since we last spoke in this format, we have had an example in the world of what people who are experiencing some pain and pretty grumpy about it can do with a Reddit subforum to organise themselves, right? So we're not talking about a lot of complex functionality here. But it could be an interesting exercise to play with it. So let me stop there. And Guillem, I'm really interested in what your response is, what your immediate response is to that.
Definitely sounds really interesting, and it points to one of the things I don't think is paid enough attention, at least on the Holochain technical discussions I am part of, which is yes, you have all these technical cool things, DNAs, zooms, and whatever, but like Holochain applications forces you a lot to think about the social first, and what comes before you even come into a membrane. And this is something that you're pointing to, I think. There is, so just to let you know, in a hackathon, I think 3 months ago, there was talk about doing some game in which you pulled friends from friends to form membranes. So there's some point of contact, but it's not really the same process, I think. So yeah, I would be really curious about how do you see this process happening? In what context this is happening? So if I want to form a group, say in my neighborhood, to do some project or something like that, is the context in which I'm announcing that my neighborhood is some open context? Where would that be happening? And where would that fit in the low-code environment? As in, do we have multiple low-code starters or things like that? What do you think about that?
So that's a good question. The sense that I'm getting is that we could end up with at least 2 different versions of low code. So the minimum, I think, is that we end up with 2. One that is designed for people who actually are developers, but for various reasons who would like to have some of the back end, the scaffolding and the complexities of building apps using Rust hidden from them, at least most of the time. And then a version of a UI that may well use the same back end, but that presents a different UI that is designed to really hide all of that complexity from people who are not interested in seeing it at all and who will only be confused by it, probably. Yeah. I mean, remember, you might well give them a switch that allows them to draw back the veil, right? So who's behind the curtain? But most of them, I anticipate would go and quickly pull it back again. And I think, I mean, does it make sense to say that the context and the scale and the scope of the thing is going to be different for each app, and that would be part of the definition process up front, right? Is that you get to describe what your app is and what the scale of it is, what the boundaries of the group are according to various parameters of distance, whether that's like geographical distance, social distance, interest-based distance. Yeah.
So okay, just I'm trying to like actually the part about agreeing and committing to something, it's so trivial in Holochain that like that part, it's I don't want to even think about how that's done, because that's like technically it's trivial. The not so trivial thing is the membrane and the process. Okay, we create this membrane and then this happens and then we create this membrane. So okay, what I imagine is you go into the low-code environment, more than app, sorry, and you say, okay, hey, I want to propose to create this group or whatever. You may already be talking to some friends about it, so you may already have some invites going on or whatever. And then this process goes on for a while, and then once the agreement is reached, then we instantiate a membrane. Or is it that the agreement process is happening inside the membrane?
Well, it's interesting, right? Because there are some groups that might form where you might actually want a process of reaching consensus about what all those things are. But then there's a way in which you can look at, so if I want to start something, right? even if I want to start some kind of online community that I'm going to run as a business, right? So say I'm going to have some kind of subscription and I'm going to provide some content and there's going to be a monthly payment for that, right? That's my space that I'm creating. And maybe I get to define how I want that to work. And then other people get to choose whether that's cool with them, whether they want to play. And so maybe, I haven't really thought this through. This is off the top of my head, but maybe it's possible to see everything that everybody creates as having some element of, membrane, rules, boundaries, law, LORE, as Stephen says, right? And sometimes LAW, as well, yes, explicitly LAW. So maybe it's always part of the process. It's just, does there need to be negotiation about it or not? And is it explicit? How explicit does it need to be?
Belinda, would it be helpful if I just gave a little insight into the history and the process? Because this has been probably 10 years in the making of a journey to understand what seems to be quite simple to begin with until you delve into it, of, as you rightfully say, I think you use the right word, consensus, and be that consensus within an enclosed group, and then what groups they want to coexist with and how to do agreements there. Would that be useful?
Yes, if you could maybe give some background to that and even an example, that would be awesome. And then I know you have some other questions as well that I want to get to before we finish. Yeah. Okay.
Well, this has come through really from about 25, 30 years of work of looking at the architecture of lots of different technologies, platforms or environments, where for one reason or another, it's been recognized that apart from having system rules, where you build a system and that's the way it works, which is the normal approach if you're doing something. So for example, if you look at a health record system, typically anywhere in the world, it's a system. So it has universal rules, which are built with technology standards and protocols and network standards and other rules on how it can function. So whether people can view that, who can view that health record, and a bunch of other things. What tends to happen over a period of time is those rules become so complex, and trying to deal with them with technical protocols becomes impossible, to the point where they seize up because you just get so many no's. There's not much you can actually do. And you can't do granular views. So you can't go down to individual consent, where different people can behave differently based upon the legal consent which they've given someone for them to act differently. So it inhibits you from being able to treat people differently or in accordance with a value system, for example, whether someone's trustworthy and vice versa. So there have been some massive problems, and very large problems like have fallen over because you just can't get these agreements in place for that deal with much more complexity and deal where there's negotiations or deal where there's exceptions to the rule. So over many years, we started looking at, well, what can you do? When blockchain came along, it was finally, I was so relieved because you could actually use a smart contract, even though that's what it wasn't intended for. You could actually manipulate a smart contract to be able to at least have a record of an agreement and give some capacity for flexibility. So for example, in the supply chain, you can agree what should happen at each point of the supply chain, both in terms of what the physical parcel should do if it's been coming down, but also things like legalistic, who has liability, and do people accept liability as well as possession of the parcel, for example, at point C. And it means that you can, over a period of time, you can then get to a utopia where you can automate the whole thing, knowing that you're actually conforming to all the requirements of who's agreed to what in the first place. Because if you can't agree on stuff, you can't automate, and you can't you can do certain things but not many. So that's where it started. And of course it was realized, and I did a lot of work, and the leading light in the blockchain world is Chris Ray, who's a barrister in London who worked with Vinny and others on looking at looking at how do you compile legalistic agreements to the point where you can do, private public partnerships of massive projects that he was looking at on, say, the Silk Road, all the way down to the area I've been most interested in, which is how do you do agreements between individual and consenting parties, whereby the conditions might change hour by hour. All right, so that's been the history of it. How do you do all of that? Blockchain kind of works for it to a degree. Ethereum 2 will be a lot better in the way that the smart contract flexibility, but there is nothing that compares with Holochain for the ability to construct agreements for coexisting either with a decentralized single membrane, multiple ones, or coexisting with centralized systems as well. So like a health record, where you can keep the first project will be, one of the ones we want to apply this methodology is where an individual owns their own health records. So they'll be giving, for the first time ever, the individual will legally own their own data. What that means is that if someone were to de-identify it, as they do today, and sell it legally, it would be common law theft, because you would have established that it was your property, unlike data today, which your personal medical record is not your legal property under common law. So what that does is establish, so first you have an agreement that you own it, then you're in a position to give legal consent to it, which means very important, because then people can act on your behalf. You can start acting as a group. So coming back to Belinda's comment about there's, the group that we've seen acting in terms of taking on Wall Street, and where you can get a group acting in unison, or lots of different groups acting in unison with each other, is all through mutual agreement. So what you need is some architecture or some basic technology which allows you to compile different agreements for different circumstances. And that's not and so going back to Guillem's point, firstly, what is the agreement on whether you can or can't enter the membrane? So it's not, I don't look at it as centralized and decentralized, it's more hierarchical. So the agreement is for you to come into this membrane, these are our agreed rules. And then it allows you to form relationships, and really leverage agency, where you can have peer-to-peer agreements or groups, syndicates within there. They should be allowed, if you're truly going to give them agency, to make agreements themselves, whatever they like, so long as they don't violate the overarching rules to enter into the membrane itself. Once you've got that kind of that structure, then you can do some really, really clever things. You can and you can then introduce notions of what I call LORE, tribal. What I call tribal agreements. Those might be cultural, they might be cultural norms, they might be things that we agree, and they're informal. But equally, you can also embody either specific laws, or, for example, you can say you can't break the law if you come into this group. You can't do things which violate the law or get people into trouble. That might be an overarching one. So you can, so then when you're doing the ontology, if you like, of the consensus ontology, it means you can then do some marvelous things whereby you can also embody in those agreements, that if you have something that you deem to be so important and it's sacrosanct, where people will act in a way different to just plain game theory, where it's what's in it for me and who wins, where people are willing to self-sacrifice some benefit for the common good, you can then start to structure those up and actually have those formalized, whereby transactions can be prioritized, or where where certain behavior can can violate whatever it is that the norms of that group. So that's been the very long history. And I think the demand on this is massive, both from the real, general real world day-to-day business that needs agreements which aren't just one size fits all central system, all the way through to communities building things. But I think the most interesting one is for vast numbers of grassroots, different ecosystems, different, as I described them, more like tribal or guilds, being able to live in accordance with their own value systems and yet collaborate with others to aggregate their power, economic, political, social, as we've seen in the last few days. So if we can build a tool, and I'll call it an app, although correct me, Guillem, if I'm wrong, but let's just say we call it an app, whereby you can establish the rules of the environment, but it also allows people to make agreements every day and then alter those agreements. So if I give you consent that you can do things, but then I withdraw that consent, then you've got a record of it. You've got a record of that transaction, for example. You also have to think through all the notions when you start putting any kind of agreement. Well, how do you enforce that? How do you, what remedies do you have for disputes? And very, very importantly, if you look back at any society in the world, they've always used witnessing, the right to bear witness, and the ability that if there is a dispute, you can call upon a witness to say, no, that happened. I mean, that's why if you look at, say, agreements and legal contracts that have come from Europe, in particularly in the UK, which wasn't so much, which came out of Anglo-Saxon, pre-written, which is what a contract's based on, is that the witnessing was much more important than the signature. It didn't matter whether it's signed. And today, a contract doesn't have to be signed or written. It supposedly helps if it is, but that depends how it's being constructed. But very often solicitors write them in a way where they actually create more dispute. What's more important, though, was it witnessed? The more witnessing that occurs, and the reason for that is it helps dispute resolution. It inhibits behavior where people dispute things when it's not true, because, of course, the shame and the verification, all those beautiful things. So what I've been working on for the last 10 years or 15 years is what kind of agreements underpin cohesion, social cohesion, financial stability, and make places safe where you can trust. And that's the work that we've been doing. And so Belinda and myself are looking, how do we translate that? And how do we make it where we've got tools that can, I would say, think of it more as an assembler, where you have different parts of a contract or an agreement, which are some of them, which are lots, where you've got libraries of where people have used them and found that they work, where you can share them. There are some where they could, some IP in there, people can kind of get, some hot for their use, and depending on the licensing, but where you can create different types of agreements, mechanisms, and learn from each other on how to create this sort of cohesion. So that's the long history of it. I think day one, we only have to do something relatively simple. And we've got two opportunities, the Health Commons, but also, as Belinda and myself were talking today, there's an opportunity with business students at the Holochain International Business School, where we could, if we had an app, like a low-code app built like this, in the summer course, this next summer course, they could actually build a model and then demonstrate that working to businesses around the world. Sorry, Belinda, that was longer than I was expected.
No worries, Stephen. So there's a question about timing. How quickly, could we actually not just build something but have it working? And I don't expect either of you to answer that right now or even on camera, but that question is there. I just want to put that on notice.
Well, one of the threads that's really interesting to me through this, and I know we're close to time, is like I don't actually have an expectation that you guys like. So to me, low code, part of the point of this is the exploration of what it takes for low code development. And to me, that I don't expect, Belinda, that you're necessarily like going to, or you have the pressure to make the app. Like what I feel like the gift you're bringing here is the willingness to share the process, the thinking process, etc., and others will follow. So the one thing I would like to ensure is that could be inaccurate. It could be that you're desperate to make the app and that all transitions and it funnels in and we capture part of that process. But it also, like, this thinking is so useful for other people who are going through a similar process, who are getting there and having this out there. I also feel like on this exploration, maybe it's in 2 weeks, maybe 4 weeks, maybe it's 6 weeks, but someone else who's kind of working on something will be willing to jump on and show that process, because part of, I know, your and Stephen's gift is to support people through, actually all of us in our different ways, in our roles and in our lives, support people through their own discovery and creative process and add value to that process. That's part of our process. So I think there's the dual track that's really going on here, which is kind of like, it's the exploration of what we're looking for, which is kind of like the things that you know are important in the world. And then there's also the building the receptivity for other people to come and start to share those ideas and start to see the convergence between the tools Guillem's building and wants to build, the kind of the ways you and Stephen want to see people thinking about building more constructive solutions, etc., and shaping those in there. So that's also, I don't know, I just wanted to offer that in case it takes a little bit of the pressure off.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that. I think with this one in particular, we're actually quite interested in the conversation about what it would take to build it.
Wow.
And, yeah.
Look at this.
So.
Well, I gave you the get out.
Yeah, I think this one's different.
Wow.
Yeah, and
wow.
Like, I totally get that, and it's for me it's really interesting, because what we are really talking is some functional component that could be used in low code, could be used in many other projects, and I'm very excited when this happens, because like the possibilities are very, very vast. So I don't think I'm ready to give any estimates yet. I would need a little more detailed on the process. So what the actual process looks like. Okay, do you propose an agreement? Is there some discussion? Is there some counter proposal? And then we come into the, like, we sign. The actual sign thing, it's like less than a day. Like in Holochain, it's easier to sign than not to sign, almost, you know? So yeah, I don't know if you have some documentation on that from previous years, or if, I don't know how is the best to proceed.
Not yet, but let's talk about it.
Okay, sure. And like, if I have something like the steps that people make, and each step, okay, you create the agreement, then you see, everyone can see the agreement or whatever. With that, I think I will have enough to start giving some estimate.
So essentially a user story, yeah?
Essentially, yeah. It doesn't have to be very, very detailed, but essentially, yeah.
Yeah.
Belinda, may I ask just something a minute?
Sure, yeah.
Well, Guillem, what we use it for, there's a couple of things which are really real, because I love building things that are real because then they're not proof of concepts. They're actually scalable prototypes, if you like. So the first one we have is for Health Commons. Now I have a meeting with Eduardo on Friday where we're going to have to use, we didn't want to, but we're going to have to use a blockchain solution for that app, which is in alpha stage, about to be alpha stage. And so what we're going to do is do the minimum design on what we need to do using a smart contract shell in order to get the minimum functionality for it to be a commons, whereby people give stuff and it's owned by everybody. And that agreement needs to be stuff. But then what we want to do is then switch that to Holo as soon as it's ready. But the other one that's really interesting will be May, June this year. Now, 2 years ago, I promised the students who joined that course that we would actually have a Holochain function like this. I called it a sandbox, where we could collectively build something, and it didn't happen. They're still waiting, as with the next year. But this year, I don't want to. I want to this time. This is the one I want to use, because what they'll do is they will then construct the ontology that could be used for businesses all around the world as a model. And what I'm looking to do is then show them how they could build this, get involved. We can work out, well, what's the fair and equitable royalty rates for building, models like this and for supporting it. All those sorts of things will be really useful. But I don't want to flag that. I've got to the beginning of next week, I've got to actually put in writing, commit that we could actually have that up and ready and functioning on a network of some description, not full commercial grade, but at least where it's functioning. So there is something for the students when they join the course. So I know this is probably a stupid question, but if for May, June, is that realistic? And you don't know the complexity of it, but assuming it's low to medium complexity, should we put that into the diary for that happening at Holt? Belinda, over to you.
So as far as application development goes, it's more than enough. Like, I would say it's maybe 2-3 times the necessary time. Like this is quite a small process if we are thinking about the minimum thing. The thing I'm not sure about is where the infrastructure will be at. In the sense that it depends. If you need Holo, it depends on where Holo is at. If with Holochain is enough, we may be luckier. So there are these layers.
So maybe we can talk about that offline over the next week and get clear on what might be possible. Get a little clearer anyway. Yeah. Stephen, how's that sound?
Magic. I mean, I cannot think of anything more universally needed, both within the Holochain fraternity and target group as we see it now, but in mainstream. And because what this will do, if you take that group that we just were referring to, had they got one of these in Holochain, they could actually, give whoever they trust common law legal power of attorney to trade on their behalf with instruments of settlement and preconditions and things called bona fides, which it means you show your credentials true and that you have no ill intent. It means then you could actually have set up a network of where this brokerage feeds into a single point of contact with the centralized world and act in unison in order to, with its full economic might and act as if they were a corporate body without being corporatized. It's massive. Once people get a taste of that, the work I've done means that within a very short period of time, anything and everything that any commodity, any product, or any service can then be the same treatment. So when I looked at, for example, with Toyota cars at this a few years ago with Toyota, and I described this day, they then said they thought it would take 5 years before no one would buy a car retail. They would buy it at wholesale price. And that's, I mean, typically a hire company will buy a new vehicle for 55% off the recommended retail price. And that means that within a year or two, we as groups can get together. Now, the interesting thing is what binds that group together that makes it work or not the technology. Do they trust each other? Do they have a shared common interest? And that's why this man, and let me know, and I'm all ready to go.
Okay. Yes, I am. It's getting exciting, guys. All right.
Yes.
Fantastic.
Always good to have a focus, right?
Yeah. Okay. Well, we've got to focus. So let's come back in a couple of weeks and see how things have progressed. And I think, like, to the point I made earlier, as we hone the focus and we're sharing that process, then I'd like over the next little while, maybe in 4-6 weeks, as we're tracking that focus, let's attract and bring in a new project into the mix that just wants to share and get started a little bit earlier, and then we can bring the sort of collective wisdom and see where they're at, and so we're focused, we're driving that, and then we're drawing someone who's more in the exploration phase. So we've got the two going on at once.
Cool.
Awesome. All right, everyone, have a fantastic week.
Yeah, you too.
You too. Thanks,
We're
guys.
celebrating.
All right. See you soon.
See you soon. Bye.